This message comes from Instacart. Instacart makes grocery shopping easier. And just because you're not doing the shopping yourself doesn't mean you don't care how it's done. With Instacart Shopper Notes, you can add details about what you want right in the app, like extra crispy rotisserie chicken or lettuce you'd pick yourself. Just leave a note so your shopper can get it right without having to ask. Download the Instacart app and shop today.
Just a heads up, y'all. This episode is going to contain some salty language. So, it's finna be some cussing. What's good, y'all? You are listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. I'm Gene Demby. All right, so, y'all, before we get into this episode, we need to hop in the DeLorean. We got to go back to the 1920s. So, imagine we in the car, vroom, vroom, vroom. Okay, so the leaders at Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, the big three, as they call themselves, saw trouble brewing because down in New York City, it was thought that 40% of students at Columbia University, who were all men because it was the 1920s and women were not allowed, right? 40% of those students were now Jewish. And the big three had seen the numbers of Jews at their universities growing too. And so they were like, no, this cannot be. We are institutions that will help anoint the future leaders of our country, the denizens of high society. These places are for good white Anglo-Saxon Protestant manly men, not these immigrant sons of Abraham. We will not turn into Columbia University. Or something like that. I don't know. I wasn't there. The point is, they were big patrician fans of anti-Semitism. But the men who ran these universities had a dilemma, since entry into those schools back then was determined almost entirely by performance on the grueling College Entry Examination Board test, a kind of precursor to the SAT. And since those Jewish boys were crushing that exam, they were increasingly the ones who were getting in. So first, Harvard was like, we're going to just put a straight-up quota on the number of Jews to stop this. But the outcry to outright discrimination got too loud. So the big three had to change course, and they went with something a little less obvious. They would each start to consider a new category to allow them to be more holistic in selecting their new students. Character. And character is so elegant, right? Because it can mean whatever the hell you want it to mean. And to assess character, Harvard started to ask for applicants to submit photos of themselves. But also, they asked prospective students to submit personal essays and descriptions of their extracurricular activities. And from there, the institutions could determine whether someone was the right fit. Not long after they started requiring these essays, and sometimes, interviews and other ways to look into the backgrounds of their applicants, the Jewish population at these schools plummeted. The people who ran those schools got what they wanted, a kind of implicit cap on the number of Jews on their campuses. But because these schools were some of the most powerful institutions, not just in academia, right, but in American life, universities across the country followed their lead. And that is the genesis of the college admissions essay, this stressful rite of passage for hundreds of thousands of people who apply to college in the United States every year. Right now, some of y'all listening to this are probably getting the last of your decision letters for college next fall and, about to make this big choice about where you might want to spend the next 4-ish years of your life. Meanwhile, universities around the country have since been using those essays, not to keep out Jews like they were a century ago, but still very much as a way to shape and mold what they want their freshman classes to look like. And top universities in particular are very concerned about this because they see themselves the way the big three saw themselves back in the 1920s as building a freshman class that will someday shape the ruling class. And part of that, for many of them, is curating a student body with a whole range of interests and experiences and majors so that their alums are at the top of a bunch of different fields.
They cannot have a campus community where everybody's going to be in the library studying. They need the kid who's going to throw the Frisbee on the line.
That's Aya Waller-Bey, and she knows what she's talking about because for years, she was an admissions officer at Georgetown.
They need the theater kids. They need the students who are going to participate in the Model UN, who's going to run the student government. They're going to need the basketball players, the football players, the crew, the tennis.
But I said despite this approach to finding an academically and culturally diverse student body, when it comes to Black students enrolling at these places, there's still one type of experience that often seems to be held up above everything else.
Trauma, turns pages, trauma. Okay, that person wrote about, okay, trauma. Okay, growing up.
Aya just finished up her PhD at the University of Michigan, and her research is about how students like her, Black, academically high achieving, and trying to be one of the very, very tiny number of applicants who get into these fancy schools, how they get a lot of quiet, often well-meaning pressure about how to pitch themselves. Aya remembers her own first personal essay. She called it Jumping for Joy, and it was about how happy she was to be accepted into this selective college prep program. But then she got some notes.
I was told that it was a great essay. You know, it was good for some of the public universities on my list, but for the more selective universities that I was going to need to write a more compelling essay.
And when you heard more compelling, you understood that to mean?
That I needed to write about hardship and overcoming trauma or pain, and something that reflected or talked more about my identity as a Black girl from Detroit, a Black girl from a low-income community, a Black girl who was first-generation college.
So Aya wrote a new essay.
So I kind of talked about how I overcame that and how I kind of used my own kind of grit and resilience and resolve to kind of push through despite having to endure very, what I would say, traumatic experiences.
That's what we're getting into on this episode, how admissions essays are used to help colleges bring in the type of students that they want, how in the wake of affirmative action being struck down by the Supreme Court, that still revolves in a lot of ways around race, and what all that tells us about the kind of diversity that is seen as valuable and visible in elite spaces.
This week on the NPR Politics Podcast, for decades, the Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked and even infiltrated hate groups. But the Justice Department now alleges the way they funded that work amounted to bank fraud. Is it an honest pursuit of justice or just the latest example of the Trump DOJ targeting the president's political opponents? Listen this week to the NPR Politics Podcast.
Most of us never worked at admissions offices at an elite university. So what does that look like for those of us who never get to peer behind the curtain?
I will say you learn that admissions offices across the country are very culturally steeped. So Georgetown feels very traditional. So that was very embedded in the Georgetown admissions practice. But no, one of the eye-opening experiences working in admissions, I think, was actually the high school visits. That was a really eye-opening experience for me because I'm going to private schools, I'm going to independent schools, I'm going to schools that have their own farms and apple cider mills, and then I'm going to schools in what we would call urban centers where I'm being escorted through a fence, through a gate by, teachers or principals to make sure I get back to my rental car safely. So really seeing the disparities just of the built environment where students were going to schools, the types of questions students, were asking. I had students at private schools ask me about Spanish study abroad program and Barcelona in their, junior year of college. And I'm like, you're a high school senior. And then I would go to some schools and, questions will be where's Georgetown? So just seeing the level of the types of questions students were asking based on socioeconomic status, based on where they were located was a very eye-opening experience. And then there was the application, the reading process, which everybody wants to know. And that's really where my third eye opened, or where I developed this really critical sociological imagination. It was reading the college essays. You
said there were some very particular themes in the admissions essays that Black students were submitting, and they were different from things you were saying from white students. So what kind of things did you see a lot in those essays? Yeah,
I want to be, sensitive here. So I did African-American kind of recruitment. So I did have more exposure to narratives of Black students, but I also encountered other racially minoritized students, low-income students in my regions that were not Black. But in this case in particular, I'm seeing stories about, homelessness. I'm seeing stories about parents with mental health crises that burning down the house. I'm seeing, sleeping in the car, these stories of just pain, stories of overcoming hardship. I also had students writing about, some kind of racial discrimination they felt because of they went to school in predominantly white high schools and the slurs they endured by teachers and educators. So students were writing about incredibly difficult experiences and being very vulnerable in this narration. And then we had, other students writing about their love for crew, the sport, and the love for, their parents may have gotten a divorce, or they want to be a doctor because grandma was a doctor, So those types of, stories, or mission trips or studies abroad, or parents was an ambassador or a diplomat rather, and they traveled to all over the world by the time they were 12. So they had these, kind of diverse experiences for sure. But there was a difference.
And your doctoral work has been focusing on this very thing. So, I'm very curious. You got feedback back when you were applying to college, not many moons ago, but a while ago, that told you to, craft your essay a certain way. Is that happening for other Black students when they tell these stories about themselves in the college admissions process?
Absolutely. This is part of the heart of my project and my research when trying to kind of investigate from where does this pressure stem. So on one hand, what I found is Black students in particular are interacting with very diverse social actors during the process, largely family. So family are actually really critical. So if you have an older sibling and said, this is what I wrote about this traumatic experience, I got into these schools, that is then being passed on to the child now going through the process.
Okay.
And I then had examples of students who worked closely with teachers at their schools. One of my participants, Dominic, had a teacher who had a binder of exemplars, a binder of successful college personal statements that he kept for students who've gone on to very selective universities.
And so the teacher's take a look at these, and
yes.
This could be a template. This is a roadmap for what a
Precisely.
good essay looks like.
Yes, right. And so when Dominic looks at the binder and he sees trauma, turns pages, trauma, okay, that person wrote about, okay, trauma, okay, growing up in a single parent house, okay, trauma, okay, having to run from trauma. Dominic then says, oh, that's what a successful essay looks like. That's what I need to do to be seen, to be legible in these admissions processes. So naturally, students are like, let me talk about all of the hardest, excuse my language, shit I've ever had to experience to show them that I'm resilient, that I can overcome this, that I can be successful. Look everything I've been through.
Do the stories in college essays from Black students who are not facing the same kind of economic hardships, right, who are better off, do those essays look different, and how so?
Fantastic question. Even students who have parents who are physicians or maybe higher income still receive messages that their pain is the most salient part of identity. I had students I interviewed, a young lady from Arizona who parents went to HBCUs and were physicians, grandparents went to HBCUs and they were physicians, and yet she still felt pressure to talk about her pain. Now, she rejected it. She was a part of the group of students I call rejectors in my research who said, absolutely not. I want to write about my love for journalism and telling stories. And she went to Obama's first inauguration and she wanted to talk about the beauty of that. So you do have students who say, I know that's what you want. That's what I see. That's what TikTok is saying. That's what, the New York Times homeless to Harvard story is suggesting. But I'm not going to tell you my pain. I'm going to write about an experience that I love and appreciate.
So obviously, lots of people, not just Black people, not just people of color, have survived hardship.
Absolutely.
How are the stories of white applicants who have lived through a lot of hardship and obviously are telling those stories in their essays too, I imagine? How are those stories different?
Jean, people often ask me that. Well, I have a student, or I work at this private, high school, and they're all white students, and they write about their pain too. And they do. I did encounter students, again, across the gamut, who talked about experiences they might consider painful or traumatic. However, I do believe stories are interpreted differently. The Black experience is often viewed collectively. When a Black student writes about growing up in a single-parent household and the challenges they faced, unfortunately, that is experienced because of racial stereotypes about the Black lived experience is often seen as part of the collective. If a white student kind of writes about, growing up in even like a, white Appalachia, even if it's in a low income environment, and they write about the challenges of seeing a dad working at a coal mine or et cetera, developing a health disease as a result, that experience is not seen as indicative of the collective white experience. That is the experience of that individual sharing that story at the time. And I think there lies the difference. I think the consequences are actually quite different from Black students who disclose their pain. And then you'll see similar, I think, even some of our first generation American students writing about their immigrant and migration experiences, right? The types of stories that they tell. It does not become, this is the singular experience of Jesus. It's like, no, this is the experience of all Mexican students who are first generation American. So I do think the way Black students are just not able to exist as individuals in the ways that their counterparts are in not just admissions processes, but more broadly as well.
How do admissions officers talk about those stories? How do we know that they're metabolizing in the ways you're talking about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think increasingly so. Universities have to really be mindful of their institutional priorities right now because of the constraints placed on by the federal administration. So I think identities such as first gen and low income are actually becoming incredibly important. I think admissions officers and universities are trying to figure out how to mark students in the process. How can we identify students? How can we categorize them in ways that are like compliant and like constitutional, because
they won't get you like
sued.
Flagged for. Yeah,
exactly right. Mm-hmm. So I do think there is a desire to identify students. And this is why the disclosures become incredibly tricky, right? Because the disclosures to a certain extent, and this is what came up in my interviews with my admissions officers, disclosures give really important context for admissions officers so they can advocate or create rationale about why Aya might deserve to get accepted into this, program, right? But the consequences, students are now saying, okay, they need me to disclose so they can see me in this process. They need to know my background, my identity. They need to know I'm first gen. They need to know I'm low income. They need to know I'm Black. They need to know all these things so they can see me qualitatively now, right? Because of the limitations post the 2023 decision on race conscious admissions. But then that puts pressure again on the students to have to, like, the way to be seen is the disclosure of pain. So I think there is a lot of a grappling that I see with admissions officers who say, we do not want students to feel like they have to talk about pain. That is a very perverse practice. However, when they do talk about pain, it actually it helps us. It provides context that we can then use to make sense of them and situate them in my admissions process to see what institutional priority they may feel. And of course, they don't speak this, as explicitly in that regard, but that's essentially how they're thinking about it. We can actually use that in our admissions evaluations or our committee reviews to kind of defend or advocate for you because you clearly have endured all these things.
I'm curious about what you think this means for like our larger understandings of Blackness, or at least as like seen through the prism of elite college admissions, that there's this idea that the way that this is most like distinguishable and, as the usual word, legible, is via trauma. Like, what are the consequences of that, I wonder?
Yes, and I think it is very consequential. And, I think firstly about the students themselves who, again, I find are put into very difficult situations where they're trying to decide at 17 or 16 years old how best to tell their stories to gain admissions to these particular schools, right? And then you couple that with this internalization, right? They've internalized, and I engage a lot of Du Bois double consciousness in my work, but it's like how they see themselves, right? It's the duality of how the Black students see themselves, but it's also how they're making sense of how people see them. So it's like, okay, they see to be Black is to have pain or trauma or grew up in this particular lived environment, but they're like, that is not my singular experience, right? Mm-hmm. Even students who chose to write about pain, who chose to disclose, also talked about the importance of the mundane and the importance of writing about experiences that, they love eating their grandma's soul food or they love playing video games, right? So I think it flattens. I think this pressure flattens how students think about their identities and the types of stories they tell. I think it sends the message that your worth is tied to how much you can overcome and endure. I think it replicates and reproduces this idea that resilience can only be found through hardship in very specific ways. I also think that it exposes problems in the admissions process, like the over-reliance on standardized testing. For a lot of students, particularly the ones who attended my HPWI site, felt like the test was historically and predominantly white institution.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes. Felt like the, SAT and some of those other quantitative kind of factors were very limiting to them. So that's why that essay became even more important. So thinking about the over-reliance on standardized testing as merit, I think universities really need to challenge that idea. But it also forces the universities. I think this is an opportunity for universities to be a lot more explicit and intentional about the messages they send schools and counselors about what types of stories are valuable in the admissions process.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? Because most people in the United States don't even attend college. And the overwhelming majority of people who go to college in this country don't go to elite universities like Georgetown or the Ivies or Stanford or Duke or whatever, right?
Right.
What does this process tell us about the way race works in this country outside of the context of like elite university admissions?
I think this work really extends beyond the confines of the academy, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's the K-12 system, whether it's any organization where people are fundraising money for a particular cause. We see this particular type of solicitations of pain as currency to attract dollars for causes that are incredibly important to us. And yet, this commodification of pain, this commodification of Black trauma, this commodification of trauma of immigrants is often incredibly valuable for organizations and institutions. And again, I think it's incredibly perverse, right? The message to me is very clear that trauma is how, Black pain, Black trauma is how you're legible. And again, outside the academy, it's please go cry in front of our donors so we can raise $100,000 so you don't have to cry anymore. So we can buy the beds that you can sleep in so you're not crying anymore. And it's just like a cycle. Like it's rewarded. Often the folks who are disclosing of the pain are not the folks benefiting from that disclosure, right? It's often the institutions who benefit most from those disclosures. So I think that's how I kind of make sense of it.
Mm-hmm. The last thing is my last question, and I just wanted to sort of zoom out, like sort of with you on this. You've been zooming out with me, but I appreciate your time. One of the things that I think most of us, I've been thinking about the writing of this professor. Her name is Natasha Wariku, and she makes the argument that like one of the reasons the college application process is so like politically fraught, right? That is this site of so much anxiety around race is because we fundamentally don't understand what colleges are trying to do when they're admitting students. Like most Americans tend to think that it's like a straight merit play. Like 1,000 students will apply to a college and the university will just pick the 75 highest achieving students based on SAT scores, based on GPA, whatever, right? And she's saying that's not how it works, and it hasn't worked like that for a very, very, very long time. Like what universities are trying to actively cultivate a certain kind of, especially elite universities, a certain kind of freshman class, right? They want athletes and they want future dancers. They want students who are going to be in tech. They want people who are going to be like culturally influential. They want future politicians. Like they're not trying to get the sort of air quote strongest students. They're actually trying to, like, especially elite universities, shape the future of the American ruling class.
Yes, and I mean, I'm a big fan of Tatasha's work, so she's spot on about that as well. And again, particularly because elite universities, to your point earlier, represent such a small percentage of post-secondary institutions, but they dominate the discourse about higher education, right? Even though it's not reflective or indicative of the majority of college-curious, college-going students. So yes, it has been so obscure, and I think intentionally so. The reason why so few folks know about the importance of building a class, right? And how they're thinking about institutional priorities, right? Having a certain number of students from specific states and majors, or who, based on their essay and activities, elite universities need students who are going to contribute to the campus community once they enroll. They cannot have a campus community where everybody's going to be in the library studying and you're not going to see those photos on the brochure of somebody throwing a Frisbee on the lawn. They need the kid who's going to throw the Frisbee on the lawn, right? They need the theater kids. They need the students who are going to participate in the Model UN, who's going to run the student government. They're going to need the basketball players, the football players, the crew, the tennis, all those things. So they're building a class. And because of the elite institutions, when you think about who has a tennis team, who has the row team, who has the crew team, those are students attending very affluent high schools that are private or in affluent neighborhoods. So there's all this sorting that's happening in high schools that is funneling into these very few institutions, but that is how they're building a class. And yet, because we have an outdated perception of what the elite universities are doing, I think coupled with racism, we're seeing the lawsuits, right? That's where a lot of those lawsuits stem from, because, hey,
They think about merit. Yeah, they're thinking about, like, merit, air quotes.
Right. Narrowly thinking about merit, reducing merit solely to quantifiable factors, which are often the grades and test scores. That is how they narrowly think about it, and that is not how universities, particularly holistic admissions, select a university. But because people cannot make sense of that, they want to know what 3 things I need to do to get in, and unfortunately, there's no 3 things. Maybe be a billionaire donor. That might get you in, but for most students, there's truly no formula, and I think that frustrates a lot of students and families.
Aya Waller-Bey is a sociologist, and her research is in narratives of racial trauma in the college application process. Thank you, Aya.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you.
I really enjoyed it.
And that's our show. But I just want to remind you that you can sign up for Code Switch Plus, which is a great way to support our show, a great way to support public media. You might have heard we could use your support. And you get to listen to every episode of Code Switch and a bunch of other NPR faves sponsor free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/codeswitch. This episode you're listening to was produced by Jess Kung. It was edited by Leah Donnella. And special thanks to Jerome Carabell, the author of The Chosen, The Hidden History of Admission and Exclusion at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I interviewed him years ago, and he explained this whole history to me. Thank you again, Jerome. And I'd be remiss if I did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch Massive, which is, of course, Christina Kala, Xavier Lopez, Daya Mortada, Yolanda Sangweni, and B.A. Parker. As for me, I'm Gene Demby. Be easy, y'all. And special thanks to Brian Jarbo, who has helped us in so many small ways over the years. May your memory be a blessing.